The Dead by Daylight All Kill chapter released on the 30th of March 2021, and from its very announcement it had been subject to scrutiny. Now, while I believe a lot of the complaints came from a vocal minority, there was definitely still a narrative being pushed that the Trickster, specifically, was a poor match for Dead by Daylight. People would claim they didn't fit the game as he wasn't horror enough, that he was too modern compared to the other killers, and that he was too anime or K-poppy. For example, here are some of the replies to this single tweet from the Dead by Daylight account announcing the chapter. "This is the worst DLC yet. Go back to releasing horror characters. This is a new low for DBD. What were y'all thinking, putting this crap into DBD? Unbelievable. Y'all are out of touch with your own game. Couldn't get the Joker, so we have the Jokester, aka the Trickster, because he's Korean. Like there are so many better people to put in the game, but first and foremost fixing the bug, and hitboxes. But that doesn't even matter because it'll never get fixed. Players, can we have a werewolf killer? DBD, here's a pop star. Eye roll emoji." These comments were also accompanied with various GIFs, images, and memes criticizing the Trickster. Even back then, I remember disagreeing with this sentiment, for the following reasons. The Trickster has a clear horror basis. He's not just a K-pop star, he's a K-pop star that let all his bandmates die in a fire, murders people, and mixes their death rattles into his songs. His story is very much a horror where he's the villain. The only difference being him and previous killers is his story takes a K-pop setting. Personally, I enjoy this unique horror take, because if we only got killers inspired by 70s or 80s slashers, the killer roster would soon become very stale, and it seems most of the community agrees with this sentiment. As time has gone on, people have warmed up to the Trickster, at least lore and thematic wise, and he might even be one of Dead by Daylight's most recognizable original killers. But why have I brought all this up? I brought up the Trickster story because recently I've been seeing some familiar discourse about Dead by Daylight. I've seen a lot of discussion talking about how a few of the most recent chapters don't really fit Dead by Daylight, but unlike with the Trickster situation where I disagreed that the Trickster didn't fit, I found myself partially agreeing with the current sentiment. The discourse generally centers around all the chapters released in Dead by Daylight's Year 8 and their place in Dead by Daylight. In today's video, we're going to work backwards through the Year 8 chapters and assess how much they fit into Dead by Daylight. Finally, we'll determine if Dead by Daylight is losing its identity as a self-proclaimed Hall of Fame of horror. The first chapter we'll look at is the Tokyo Ghoul chapter. This chapter will be the first time Behavior have taken a killer from the manga medium, manga being a type of Japanese graphic novel or comic book. In Tokyo Ghoul, ghouls exist along humans, set apart by the fact they can't eat normal food, instead having to eat human flesh. They have increased speed and strength and are armed with a special predatory organ called a kagune. These are the red things pointing out of Kaneki's back. While the series is classified as a dark fantasy, it has many horror aspects, including a lot of gore, body horror, and general psychological horror. Now, if we are to decide if Tokyo Ghoul belongs in Dead by Daylight, based on what I've mentioned previously, I believe it does. Tokyo Ghoul clearly has a horror basis despite technically being a dark fantasy. I do think generally people are slightly turned off by Tokyo Ghoul due to a general dislike of anime, but I do think if Dead by Daylight wants to be a self-proclaimed Hall of Fame of horror, you have to include characters from all mediums, including manga. Next, let's look at Dead by Daylight's only original chapter in Year 8, Doomed Curse. The star of this chapter is Portia, the Houndmaster. Portia's lore is quite good in my opinion. Because I'd wager most people haven't read her lore, I'll give you a quick summary so we're all on the same page. The Houndmaster's story follows her as the daughter of a sailor and merchant who traveled the world. She would accompany her father on some of these voyages. It's on one of these where she gets a litter of Corso puppies, the runt being Snug, the dog in her power. Her life is quickly upended when Mad Moloch, a dreaded pirate, raids her ship. He'd make the captured crew fight each other to the death. He would torture and ultimately kill Portia's father for refusing to participate in these fights. Moloch would use the young Portia as a pawn to raid and plunder villages. Portia would separate herself from Moloch by navigating one of the ships into a storm, shipwrecking her and Snug. Over the years, Portia would escape the island and cause terror across the Caribbean by stealing gold from freebooters and torturing them sadistically. She did this all in search of Moloch for revenge. Eventually, she'd lull him into a trap and then feed him his own son roasted as revenge. Unfortunately for Portia, the entity would drag her into the fog before she could deal the final blow to Moloch, leaving her bloodlust forever unsatiated. With Doomed Curse being an original chapter, it's kinda hard to argue against it being a fit for Dead by Daylight. It was literally designed for Dead by Daylight. While I do like Portia's story, I'd say it falls closer to being a thriller rather than explicitly horror. With that said, the story produces a bloodthirsty killer, so I believe it has a place in Dead by Daylight. Next, let's talk about the Castlevania chapter. While there is a Castlevania show on Netflix, this chapter is specifically based on the Castlevania game series. The plot of these games simply follows a clan of vampire hunters called the Belmonts, who through the generations defeat Dracula every 100 years when he's resurrected. The games are action-adventure platformers, having the player make their way through Castle Dracula fighting all kinds of monsters. When looking at the gameplay of Castlevania, it doesn't strike me as very scary when compared to other horror game IPs that are in Dead by Daylight. With that said, it is very clear gothic horror themes. With Dracula being the main villain, it doesn't matter too much if the games aren't explicitly scary, as the character himself is such a horror icon, I can see why behavior could justify adding him to the game. Next, let's examine the only solo survivor chapter in Year 8, the Tomb Raider chapter. Like Castlevania, the Tomb Raider chapter is also based in a series of games. The games follow Lara Croft, a fictional British archaeologist who travels the world searching for various artifacts and exploring tombs and ruins. The Tomb Raider games are very much action-adventure games. While the previous chapters on this list have had at least some horror aspects to them, it would be a very large stretch to call Tomb Raider a horror. With that being said, this is only a solo survivor chapter. It is very obvious that the criteria for being a survivor in Dead by Daylight is much more lax than a killer. For example, Nicolas Cage. When looking at Laura through specifically a survivor lens, she does fit in quite nicely, so I can see why behavior decided to add her. Finally, let's look at the chapter that kicked off Year 8, the Dungeons & Dragons chapter. D&D is, as defined by Oxford Languages, a fantasy role-playing game set in an imaginary world based loosely on medieval myth. It's a physical tabletop game, the first of this type of medium to be added to Dead by Daylight. It's a very unique situation because while Dungeons & Dragons has its own mythos, it's usually up to the dungeon master, one of the players, to create their own story or campaign, meaning behavior had some creative liberties when designing the chapter. This is best seen with the survivors of this chapter, who are made specifically for Dead by Daylight. Dungeons & Dragons is very much a fantasy type of game. While you could possibly make your own horror campaign, that's generally not what most players do. This makes it kind of a strange fit for Dead by Daylight, until you see how much the developers talk about the IP. It's very clear that the developers at Behavior have a very clear passion and love for D&D. Many have mentioned that they play it fairly frequently. With this knowledge, it's clear to see that it was a passion project for many of the developers, so it's understandable why it's in the game. Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll remember that I said I partially agreed with the sentiment that a few of the recent chapters don't particularly fit in Dead by Daylight, but I'm after just explaining why I understand each chapter's inclusion. So what's my problem? Am I just a hypocrite? Am I stupid? My problem is the fact that all these licenses were added in succession. Most of the Year 8 chapters either aren't horror at all, like Tomb Raider or Dungeons & Dragons, or only have some slight horror themes, like Castlevania or The Doomed Curse. I think each of these chapters deserve their spot in the game, but when added in succession, it leaves a bit to be desired if you're a horror fan. I'm not against Behavior adding licenses that aren't explicitly horror. I'm actually for it. Licenses like these can act as surprises and keep you on your toes so you never know what's coming next. But when all you have are these chapters that range from not horror to kind of horror, it can be a bit disappointing as a horror fan. I personally have checked out stuff after it's entered Dead by Daylight because I like horror and usually horror is what's added. I checked out Resident Evil, Hellraiser, Silent Hill and ended up loving those franchises. Now I know not every license or chapter is going to be for me, but I don't think I'm wrong for feeling a little disappointed when there's almost a full year of chapters and licenses that aren't really horror. At the end of the day, Dead by Daylight is Behavior's game. They can add whatever IP they like. I just hope they don't stray too far away from their horror roots. I feel that one argument that could be made for the recent diversion from horror chapters is that there aren't many horror IP left that Behavior haven't added to the game, but I strongly disagree with this argument. There are still hundreds of various horror licenses that Behavior can pursue to add to the game. So much so that I'm currently working on a list of my top 5 horror licenses that I want to see in Dead by Daylight. So if you'd like to see that list, I'd ask that you subscribe so you don't miss it when it comes out. Finally, I'd like to ask, what do you think? Do you think Behavior is steering too far away from horror, or am I overreacting? Let me know down in the comments. That's all for now. Thank you, and goodbye.